This morning we're continuing our sermon series looking at the I am statements in John's Gospel. In case you missed last week, I'm going to put up a more thorough explanation of what that means on our YouTube channel. But I'm going to give a Cole's Notes version of it here. In Exodus, God reveals that his name is I am to Moses. And when the Old Testament was translated into Greek in the 4th century BC, they translated that as ego eimi, I am, in Greek, even though in Greek typically you just say eimi because the I, ego, is implied. And several points in John's Gospel, Jesus says ego eimi, and commentators have picked up on that when he's saying that, he's invoking God's name from Exodus. And so he's using that to say something about himself that's also true of God the Father. All right, that's my whirlwind explanation. When I was a young boy, I remember I was afraid of the dark. Not all the time. I was okay sleeping in my darkened room. It always happened when I walked into a situation or place that was dark. So we would go out somewhere and come home, and we never left lights on inside the house. And so I was kind of afraid that when I opened the door and I went into a place that there would be a burglar, and they were probably armed to the teeth. I think I had probably been watching too much Unsolved Mysteries. I remember, though, that I always felt much less anxiety when my mother was with me if she would go in the door first. I don't know what I was thinking. My mother's petite and 5'2". Was she going to overpower these imaginary burglars? I don't think so. But I think that there's something about having somebody who is bigger and stronger and you know who is on your side in a situation that is anxiety-inducing that makes us feel more confident and more able to deal with that situation. In today's story, we're going to look at the disciples when they encounter Jesus walking on the water, and they have a similar experience to that. So let's read starting in John chapter 4, 16 to 22. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I, ego eimi. Don't be afraid." Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. So if you read this story with a surface reading, it's a remarkable story, but it doesn't seem like it's all that complex. So the disciples had left without Jesus in the boat, and the reason that Jesus wasn't with them isn't immediately obvious, at least in this account. And they had sailed out into the Sea of Galilee, which is about 6 miles across. And they seemed to take quite a while to get about halfway across the lake. Now, people say that the Sea of Galilee is subject to very violent and sudden changes in weather due to the topography and stuff. And that even experienced sailors like Peter and James and Andrew and John would have been, because they were fishermen who fished on that sea, it would have been a harrowing experience. And so they find themselves out in the middle of the lake, making no headway, getting nowhere, and suddenly Jesus comes. And of course, you'd freak out too if you saw somebody walking on water. They think he's a ghost. But then Jesus calls out, "It's me," but he uses that ego eimi language. And then they let him into the boat. And then, even though they must be several miles from shore, they, poof, appear on shore. It's an interesting story. And if we just simply look at it on the surface, we can probably deduce a few things from it. The fact that Jesus has power to walk on water, so he's pretty cool, like a superhero or something. But we miss a lot of the depth of what this story is trying to teach us, because we aren't tuned into the stories that go before that the original audience would have been cued into. So the early church, the audience that John had for this, was very tuned into the Old Testament. It was their Bible. There wasn't a New Testament yet. There it was being written and it had not yet been collected and made into an authoritative collection of texts of Scripture for the church. And so they were very attuned to the Old Testament. And in the Old Testament, there are two stories that serve as the source of almost all other metaphors that we see in the Scripture. And they're the creation narrative in Genesis chapter 1 and the Exodus experience that we read about in the book of Exodus. And this makes sense. God talks about himself as being special primarily in relation to these two events. He is the creator God, the one who made heaven and earth, and he is the God who delivered Israel from slavery in the land of Egypt. And so when we look at these two stories and keep those two stories in mind, new details begin to emerge as we interpret this story. So the first theme that we must look at is creation. Now, if you know your Bible at all, you know that it opens with the verse Genesis 1:1 that says, "In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth." But Genesis 1:2, the very next verse, the second verse in the whole Bible, says, "Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters." So bear this in mind. The world before creation is talked about as if it is the deep, like it is a sea or an ocean or a body of water that seems to be stirred up. Darkness was over the surface. Remember, this story is set at night after it's dark. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the water. And in this case, we have Jesus, the Son of God, walking on the water. That's interesting. The second major theme, of course, is the Exodus. And this one is not quite as obvious, but if you look at the previous story in Mark's Gospel, it's the story of the feeding of the 5,000. And in that story, Jesus gives a multitude of Israelites bread in the wilderness. Now, if you think back to the Exodus story and the manna, God gives the multitude of Israelites bread in the desert. So that story very loudly echoes the Exodus story. But the great story of deliverance in the Exodus is the parting of the Red Sea. The Israelites are trapped. They've got the Red Sea at their back, and Pharaoh's army is pursuing them. They may be wanting to wipe them all out, or maybe to take them all back as slaves. But God intervenes, and he parts the waters and allows the Israelites to walk through them, which in a manner of thinking or speaking is like walking on the water. It also shows that God is the master of the waters. You see, Jewish thinkers thought of the water as the abode of demons. When you look at this back to Genesis 1, it is the uncreated world. It's what things were before God says, "Let there be light." God tames creation, makes a safe space on the dry land for the human beings. And so there's this sense that the waters are sort of this leftover, untamed reality in creation. And so they're associated with this sort of primordial evil of uncreation. And so Jews had a hard time with the ocean. And it's kind of understandable that people would, given just how many people ended up dying from drowning in that culture. And so what we see is this picture of how Jesus' presence echoes God's presence in creation, and how there is sort of a picture of the Exodus at work in this story. So those are some Old Testament allusions that we need to keep in our mind before we interpret this passage. There's also a New Testament allusion. Mark's gospel was the first gospel to be written. That's the opinion of most biblical scholars these days. And Mark's gospel would have been written 20 or 30 years before John's gospel. And so probably the people that John is writing to have an awareness and an understanding of Mark's gospel. And in Mark's gospel, the boat is very clearly serving as a metaphor for the church. Tim Woodruff, a scholar, says of the boat in Mark, in the boat there is safety from the storm, camaraderie with Christ, shared work and experiences, a common direction and purpose. Mark's boat functions as a metaphor for the church. Now, this is such an interesting metaphor. I have a whole sermon series planned on the boat and the church set for the fall or the late summer. So we'll talk about this again in more detail in about 6 months, Lord willing. But in any case, the awareness of the boat as a metaphor for the church is probably also present in the mind of John's original audience. So when we take these Old Testament and New Testament ideas and we keep them in view when we read this story, some ideas that maybe are a little less obvious on a surface reading start to pop out. The first is that this story serves as a parable for the church without God's presence. If the boat is the church, the disciples have left and have gone out in the boat without Jesus. And it's true that that's an easy thing for us to do. We don't need Jesus in order to do church things, do we? We can write sermons and listen to sermons in which Jesus isn't present. We can sing songs from a hymnal or from our favorites among the modern worship songs. We can gather on a Sunday morning, and Jesus doesn't have to be present with us. In fact, there's a section in the letters to the church in Revelation in which Jesus says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone would hear my voice and open the door, I will eat with them and they will eat with me." And we often misinterpret this as being about evangelism, but it's not. It's actually Jesus standing on the outside of his church, knocking the door and saying, "Hey, it's me, Jesus. I'm supposed to be the middle of this thing and you've locked me outside. Can you let me in, please?" And in that same way, we as the church have to be very careful that we're not locking Jesus on the outside. We're not being like the disciples who decide to row even though Jesus isn't with them. And what happens when the disciples go off and row off across the lake when Jesus isn't with them? They get nowhere. They waste a lot of effort and they still are in the boat. And when we as the church be church without Jesus, we spend all of our time in the boat. We never get to shore. If the boat is the church, then shore is mission. The place where we're going, the place where we serve with Jesus. But we spend all of our time just being church if Jesus is here, because we never get the things we need from church if Jesus isn't here. And so it reminds us, let us welcome Jesus in. Let's be attentive to his presence, or else we'll spend all of our time in these four walls and never actually get out into the community in which we're situated to serve people, to testify about who Jesus is and what Jesus has done. So that's the first lesson. We need Jesus in our church. The second lesson that we see when we read this through this metaphorical lens is that Jesus is revealing his identity to his people. Now, we say Jesus is the Son of God. He is God incarnate, but Jesus' disciples haven't figured that out by this point in the story. And so Jesus is revealing slowly who he is. He's planting seeds that help them to understand that he is the incarnation of God himself. And this story is meant to plant a big seed. Jesus walking on the water in the dark is meant to say that he is the same as this God who's described as having a presence hovering over the waters in the Genesis 1:2 narrative. And so we need to remember that God looks like Jesus. It's easy for us sometimes to make God according to our own preferences or according to our own fears. When you read the Old Testament, sometimes you scratch your head and wonder, who is God? On one hand, he says he is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, and in the next minute he seems like he's on a hair trigger. Sometimes we look at the Old Testament and we're captured by the beauty of the expression of God, and sometimes, if we're really honest with ourselves, maybe we're a little bit horrified by the picture of God. Is God really commanding genocide? But here's the thing. Jesus is not the good cop to the Father's bad cop. Jesus is the complete expression of the perfect heart of God. Jesus says to his disciples, anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. In other words, this isn't a good cop, bad cop routine. This is God's perfect and final expression of who he is. Every other expression of who God is that we see has to answer to God as he reveals himself in Jesus. And so if the God that we see in the Old Testament differs from the God revealed in Jesus, then that is a misunderstanding that we have of who God is and what he stands for. Now, this is very important because we are meant to be Jesus' representatives in the world. And if we represent Jesus as a distorted picture of God, then it affects our ministry in unfortunate ways. I'm currently reading a book called Jesus and John Wayne about how a militant and hypermasculine form of Christianity has actually led the evangelical church to embrace people and values that are completely antithetical to what Jesus stood for. When we don't fix our eyes on Jesus and understand that he is the perfect revelation of God, then we make God in our own image. And when we do that, our own ideological preferences become the ground for our understanding of who he is, and then we show the world a different God than the God that we say we worship. Oftentimes, these are the times when Christians look like hypocrites. And so we have to remember, number one, the church can do nothing without Jesus, so we need to invite him in. And number two, Jesus is God. He is the perfect revelation of God, and we need to keep our focus on him if we are to be faithful witnesses to who he is to this world. The third lesson that we learn from this text is that God is bigger and stronger than all of the forces arrayed against us. Remember, the Jews thought of the sea as the abode of the demons. They would be terrified by these storms because they would feel like they were up against a foe that was more powerful than them, but along comes Jesus walking calmly on the water, showing that his presence is stronger, more powerful than the presence of the demonic forces symbolized in the water. And then he brings the church to land immediately. He is the master over the sea. And that tells us that he is the master over all of the things and the forces that try and stand in the way of the mission that he has given his church. He's told us to go and make disciples. He's told us to bear witness to his victory on the cross. These are intimidating and daunting tasks because we feel like we are up against systems that don't want this truth proclaimed. But Jesus is more powerful than these systems. Even though he sometimes looks like he's losing, even when he's losing, he's winning. Jesus dies on the cross, and it looks like he's pretty much done. But in the cross, or on the cross, he wins the greatest victory for God. You see, Jesus demonstrates for us this idea of winning by losing. And so we can have confidence that Jesus has our back when we go out into this world. And even when it feels like we are losing, we are winning. Somebody is standing with us. Now, my mother would not have been much of a protection against armed burglars if we had happened to walk in on them when I was coming home as a child. But Jesus is stronger than them. Jesus is stronger than any demonic force that we might fear. Jesus is stronger than all the powers and authorities that stand in opposition to him and his kingdom. And so we can have confidence that God is with us and God is for us. And that changes the way that we live as Christians in this world. So, as we look at this story, let's remember, be church with Jesus at the center, because it's real easy to leave him behind on the shore. Number 2, remember that Jesus is God, and that if we try to represent a God that is not expressed in Jesus, then we are misrepresenting God to the world. And number 3, Jesus has our back. He's with us, he's going with us, and he is more powerful than the forces that are against us. If God can be for us, who can be against us?